Hello, comrades. Red Jihad here. I got a video for you. It's going to be the entire manifesto of the Red Army faction, and here goes, you guys.
The Urban Guerrilla Concept, April 1971. We must draw a clear line between ourselves and the enemy. Now I hold that it is bad as far as we are concerned if a person, a political party, an army, or a school is not attacked by the enemy, for in that case it would definitely mean that we have sunk to the level of the enemy. It is good if we are attacked by the enemy, since it proves that we have drawn a clear dividing line between the enemy and ourselves. It is still better if the enemy attacks us wildly and paints us as utterly black and without a single virtue. It demonstrates that we have not only drawn a clear dividing line between the enemy and ourselves, but have achieved spectacular successes in our work. Now see Mega 26, 1939-11. Concrete answers to concrete questions. I still insist that without investigation there cannot possibly be any right to speak. MAO2, some comrades have already made up their minds about us. For them, it is the demagoguery of the bourgeois press that links these anarchist groups with the socialist movement. In their incorrect and pejorative use of the term anarchism, they are no different than the Springer Press. We don't want to engage anyone in dialogue on such a shabby basis. Many comrades want to know what we think we're doing. The letter to 883 in May 1970 was too vague. The tape Michel Ray had, extracts of which appeared in Speedio, was not authentic, and, in any event, was drawn from a private discussion. Ray wanted to use it as an aid for an article she was writing. Either she tricked us, or we overestimated her. If our practice was as hasty as she claims, we'd have been caught by now. Spiegel paid Ray an honorarium of $1,000 for the interview. Almost everything the newspapers have written about us, and the way they write it, has clearly been a lie. Plans to kidnap Willy Brandt are meant to make us look like political idiots, and claims that we intend to kidnap children are meant to make us look like unscrupulous criminals. These lies go as far as the authentic details in concrete number 5, which proved to be nothing more than unreliable details that had been slapped together, that we have officers and soldiers, that some of us are slaves of others, that comrades who have left us fear reprisals, that we broke into houses or used violence to take passports, that we exercise group terror. All of this is bullshit. The people who imagine an illegal armed organization to be like the Freakups or the Fiend, 3 are people who hope for a pogrom. The psychological mechanisms that produce such projections and their relationship to fascism have been analyzed in Horkheimer and Adorno's authoritarian personality and Reich's mass psychology of fascism. A compulsive revolutionary personality is a contradiction, an ejector, a contradiction in terms. A revolutionary political practice under the present conditions, perhaps under any conditions, presumes the permanent integration of the individual's personality in political beliefs, that is to say, political identity. Marxist criticism and self-criticism has nothing to do with self-liberation, but a lot to do with revolutionary discipline. It is not the members of a left organization, writing anonymously or using pen names, who are just interested in making headlines, but Concrete itself, whose editor is currently promoting himself as a sort of left-wing Eddie Zimmerman, for producing jack-off material for his market niche. Many comrades spread untruths about us too. They brag that we lived with them, that they organized our trip to Jordan, that they know about our contacts, that they are doing something for us, when, in fact, they are doing nothing. Some only want to make it look like they are in the know. Gunther Vio IGT5 had to pay for puffing himself up in a conversation with Durand Thomas, exclaiming he was the one who freed Varga, which he regretted when the cops showed up. It's not easy to clear things up with denials, even when they're true. Some people want to use these lies to prove that we're stupid, unreliable, careless, or crazy. By doing so, they encourage people to oppose us. In reality, they are irrelevant to us. They are only consumers. We want nothing to do with these gossip mongers for whom the anti-imperialist struggle is a coffee clash. Many are those who don't gossip, who have some understanding of resistance, who are pissed off enough to wish us luck, who support us, because they know that there is no point spending life implicated in and adapted to this crap. What happened at the Methodist 89 house, Marlowe's arrest, was not due to carelessness on our part, but to betrayal. The traitor was one of us. There is no guarantee against that for people who do what we do. There is no certainty that comrades will not break under extreme police pressure, or will hold up in the face of the terror that the system uses against us, with which it attacks us. The pigs wouldn't have the power if they didn't have these tools. Our existence makes some people feel pressured to justify themselves, to avoid political discussion with us, to avoid comparing their practice to ours. They distort even the smallest details. For example, the rumor is still circulating that Barda had only 3 or 9 or 12 months to serve, though the correct length of time is easily ascertained. 3 years for arson, a further 6 months on probation, and approximately 6 months for falsifying documents. Of these 48 months, Andreas Barda had served 14 in 10 different Hessian prisons. 9 times he was transferred because of bad behavior, for example, organizing mutinies and resistance. Reducing the remaining 34 months to 3, 9, or 12 is intended to reduce the moral justification for the May 14 breakout. In this way, some comrades rationalize their fear of the personal consequences of entering into a political discussion with us. The question frequently asked as to whether we would have proceeded with the breakout if we had known that Linke would be shot can only be answered with a no. The question of what we would have done is ambiguous, pacifist, moralistic, platonic, and detached. Anyone who thinks seriously about the breakout would not pose this question, but would think it through for himself. In asking this question, people only want to see if we are as brutal as the Springer Press claims. It's like an interrogation in catechism class. It is an attempt to trivialize the question of revolutionary violence by treating revolutionary violence and bourgeois violence as the same thing, which leads nowhere. In anticipating all the possible developments, there was no reason to believe that a civilian would intervene. It is suicidal to think that one can conduct a jailbreak unarmed. On May the 14th, the cops fired the first shots. This was the case in Frankfurt as well, where 2 of us ran for it because we are not going to just let ourselves be arrested. The cops shot to kill. Sometimes we didn't shoot at all, and when we did, we didn't shoot to kill. In Berlin, in Nuremberg, in Frankfurt, .7 it can be proven because it is true. We do not use firearms recklessly. The cop who finds himself in the contradiction of being a little man and a capitalist pawn, a low-paid employee and monopoly capitalism's agent, is not obliged to follow orders. We shoot back if someone shoots at us. The cop who lets us go, we let him go as well. It is clear that the massive hunt for us is really directed against the entire socialist left in the Federal Republic and West Berlin. This circus cannot be justified by the small amount of money or the few cars and documents we are alleged to have stolen, or by the attempted murder they're trying to pin on us. The ruling class has been scared out of its skin. They thought that they had the state and all of its inhabitants, classes, and contradictions under control, right down to the last detail. The intellectuals reduced to their magazines, the left isolated in its own circles, Marxism-Leninism disarmed, and internationalism demoralized. However fragile it may pretend to be, the power structure is not so easily damaged. One should not be tricked by the hue and cry into contributing to all this noise. We are not saying that the organization of armed resistance groups can replace the legal proletarian organizations, that isolated actions can replace the class struggle, or that armed struggle can replace political work in the factories or neighborhoods. We are arguing that armed struggle is a necessary precondition for the latter to succeed and progress, that armed struggle is the highest form of Marxism-Leninism now, and that it can and must begin now, as without it there can be no anti-imperialist struggle in the metropole. We are not Blanquists, nor are we anarchists, though we think Blanqui was a great revolutionary, and the personal heroism of many anarchists is certainly above reproach. We have not even been active for a year yet. It is too soon to draw conclusions. The extensive publicity that Genscher, ZIMMERMAN and Nathan Company have given us opens up the propaganda opportunity which we are using to share a few thoughts. To the metropole. The Federal Republic, the crisis isn't the result of the stagnation of development, but of development itself. Since the aim is to increase profit, development encourages parasitism and waste, harming whole social sectors, multiplying needs that it cannot satisfy, and accelerating the disintegration of social life. A monstrous apparatus is necessary to control, by means of manipulation and open repression, the tensions and revolts which it itself often provokes. The crisis in American political unity caused by the student rebellion and the Black movement, the spread of the student struggle in Europe, the vehement renewal and the growth of worker and mass struggles leading to the May explosion in France, the tumultuous social crisis in Italy, and the rebirth of dissatisfaction in Germany all indicate the nature of the situation. Il Manifesto, the necessity of communism. Extract from Thesis 33-9. The comrades from Il Manifesto rightly place the Federal Republic of Germany last in their analysis, vaguely describing the situation here as dissatisfaction. West Germany, which VSDL-10 described 6 years ago as an economic giant, but a political dwarf, has not lost any of its economic power since, while its external and internal political power has increased. With the formation of the Grand Coalition in 1966, the political danger posed by the coming recession was forestalled. With the emergency law, the instrument was created to secure unified ruling class action in the event of future crises. The unity of political reactionaries and all those who cling to legality was established. The social liberal coalition succeeded, neutralizing the dissatisfaction that had become evident in the student revolt and the extra-parliamentary movement. Insofar as the SPD's supporters have not broken with reformism, this section of the intelligentsia has been prevented from embracing a communist alternative. In this way, reformism acts as a brake on the anti-capitalist struggle, as politics is opening new markets for capitalism, while at the same time it represents the German contribution to an accommodation and alliance between U.S. imperialism and the Soviet Union, which the USA requires in order to have a free hand for its wars of aggression in the Third World. This government seems to have managed to separate the new left from the old anti-fascists, cutting off the new left from its own history, a history of the working class movement. The DKP, which can thank the new collusion between U.S. imperialism and Soviet revisionism for its newly full status, has organized demonstrations in favor of this government's politic. Niemöller, a symbol of anti-fascism, is shilling for the SPD in the upcoming election. Using the smokescreen of the common good, the government has established state control and curbed the union bureaucracy with its wage guidelines and its notion of concerted action. The strikes of September 69 showed that things have been overwhelmingly skewed to the benefit of profit, and the fact that these strikes only address economic issues indicates how firmly the government holds the reins. The system shows its strength in the way that the Federal Republic, with its 2 million foreign workers and unemployment approaching 10%, can make use of the looming recession to develop the terror and the disciplinary measures that unemployment implies for the proletariat, without having to deal with any political radicalization of the masses. In exchange for development aid and military support for the USA's wars of aggression, the Federal Republic profits from the exploitation of the Third World, without having to take responsibility for these wars, and without having to struggle against internal opposition. While it is no less aggressive than U.S. imperialism, the Federal Republic is less vulnerable. The political options open to imperialism here have not been exhausted in either their reformist or their fascist forms, and imperialism has not exhausted its ability to either integrate or repress the contradictions that it produces. The Roth-Serban guerrilla concept is not based on an optimistic evaluation of the situation in the Federal Republic and West Berlin. 3. The student revolt, the conclusion that it is impossible to separate the revolution in the heartland from that in underdeveloped areas is based on an analysis of the unique character of the capitalist ruling system. Without revival of revolution in the West, the imperialists, with their logic of violence, will be able to develop their exit strategy through a catastrophic war, and it will be impossible to prevent the world's superpowers from imposing crushing oppression. Il Manifesto, from Thesis 52, to dismiss the student movement as a petty bourgeois revolt is to reduce it to the grandiose claims that accompanied it, to deny its roots in the contradiction between bourgeois society and bourgeois ideology. It means recognizing its obvious shortcomings, while ignoring the theoretical level that this anti-capitalist protest managed to achieve. The pathos with which the student movement became aware of its mental immiseration in the knowledge factories was certainly exaggerated, as was the identification of this with the situation of the exploited peoples of Latin America, Africa, and Asia. The comparison between the mass circulation of biles eating here and the massive bombing of Vietnam was a grotesque oversimplification, just as it was arrogant to compare the ideological critique of the system here and the armed struggle over there. The students believed that they were the revolutionary subject insofar as it was based on the appeal of Marcuse, betrayed their ignorance as to the actual nature of bourgeois society and the mode of production which it has established. The student revolt in the Federal Republic and West Berlin, with its street fighting, its arsones, its use of counter-violence, its pathos, as well as its exaggerations and ignorance, in short, with its practice, has the merit of having reconstructed Marxism-Leninism, at least in the consciousness of the intelligentsia, as that political theory without which the political, economic, and ideological factors and their outward manifestations cannot be combined into an overall analytical perspective. Without this, internal and external relationships cannot be described. The student movement was based on the contradiction between the theory of academic freedom and the reality of monopoly capitalism's control of the universities. Precisely because it was based on this, and not merely on ideology, it didn't run out of steam before it had established the relationship between the crisis in the universities and the crisis of capitalism, if only in theory, not before it was clear to the student movement and their public that liberty, equality, and fraternity would not be achieved by appeals to human rights or the Uncharter, that what was occurring here was what had always occurred in the colonialist and imperialist exploitation of Latin America, Africa, and Asia. Discipline, subordination, and brutality for the oppressed, and for those who take up their struggle by protest, those who resist and wage the anti-imperialist struggle. In its ideological critique, the student movement viewed almost all aspects of state repression as expressions of imperialist exploitation. In the spring of campaign, in the demonstrations against American aggression in Vietnam, in the campaign against class justice, in the Bundeswehr campaign, (11) in the campaign against the emergency laws, and in the high school student movement. Expropriate Springer, smash NATO, resist consumer terror, resist education terror, resist trend terror. These were all correct political slogans. They aimed to expose the contradiction between the needs which could be satisfied through the development of productive forces, on the one hand, and the pressure of irrational subordination to class society, on the other. Their identity was not based on class struggle here, but rather on the knowledge that they were part of an international movement, that they were dealing with the same class enemy as the Vietcong, the same paper tigers, the same pigs. The second merit of the student movement was that it broke through the old left's parochialism. The old left's popular front strategy in the form of the Easter marches, the German Peace Union, the Deutsche Volkspartei, an irrational hope for a massive landslide in some election or another, a parliamentary fixation on Strauss here or Heinemann there, their pro- and anti-communist vacillation about the GDR, their isolation, their resignation, and their moral conflicts, ready for every sacrifice, incapable of any practice. The socialist section of the student movement developed its consciousness, in spite of theoretical errors, from the correct recognition that the revolutionary initiative in the West can be based on the crisis in the global balance of power and on the development of new forces in old countries. Il Manifesto, Thesis 55. They based their agitation and propaganda on what can be considered the most important aspect of German reality. They opposed the global strategy of imperialism by internationalizing national struggles, by creating a connection between the national and international aspects of the struggle, between traditional forms of struggle and international revolutionary initiatives. They managed to turn their weakness into strength, because they recognized that continuing resignation, parochialism, reformism, and popular front strategies could only lead to a dead end for socialist politics in the post- and pre-fascist conditions existing in the Federal Republic and West Berlin. The left knew that it was correct to link the distribution of socialist propaganda in factories with actually preventing the distribution of fowls eating. It was correct to link propaganda against this being sent to Vietnam with actual attacks on military planes targeting Vietnam, and the Brunswick campaign with attacks on NATO airports. It was correct to link the critique of class justice with the blowing up of prison walls, and the critique of the Springer Corporation with the disarming of its private security services. It was correct to set up radio stations, to demoralize the police, to have safe houses for Bundeswehr deserters, to combine agitation amongst foreign workers with the production of false documents, to prevent the production of napalm by sabotaging factories. It was an error, however, to make their own propaganda dependent on supply and demand, to have no newspaper if the workers could not yet finance, no car if the movement could not afford it, no transmitter because they had no license for it, no sabotage because capitalism wouldn't collapse immediately as a result. The student movement fell apart when its typically student and perfect bourgeois form of organization, anti-authoritarianism, proved itself ill-suited to achieving its goals. Its spontaneity proved ineffective in the factories, nor could it create a functioning urban guerrilla movement or a socialist mass organization. Unlike in Italy and France, the spark of the student movement here failed to ignite the prairie fire of class struggle, and it was at that point that it collapsed. It could enumerate the aims and contents of the anti-imperialist struggle, but it could not be the revolutionary subject, could not offer the necessary organizational structure. Unlike the proletarian organizations of the New Left, the Red Army faction doesn't deny its roots in the history of the student movement, a movement that reshaped Marxism-Leninism into a weapon of class struggle and established the international basis for evolutionary struggle in the metropole. 4. The primacy of practice. If you want to know a certain thing, or a certain class of things directly, you must personally participate in the practical struggle to change reality, to change that thing or class of things, for only thus can you come into contact with those phenomena. Only through personal participation in the practical struggle to change reality can you uncover the essence of that thing or class of things and comprehend them. Marxism emphasizes the importance of theory precisely and only because it can guide action. If we have a correct theory, but merely prate about it, pigeonhole it and do not put it into practice, then that theory, however good, is of no significance. Nazi-Time. On PRACT-ICE 12, the decision of leftists and socialists, the student movement's authority figures, to turn to the study of scientific socialism and transform the critique of political economy into a self-criticism of the student movement was at the same time a decision to retreat into the classroom. Considering their paper output, their organizational models, and their bombastic statements, one might think that these revolutionaries were leading a violent class struggle, as if 1967/68 was the 1905 of socialism in Germany. In 1903, Lenin pointed out in What Is to Be Done that the Russian workers needed a specific theory and postulated, in opposition to the anarchists and the social revolutionaries, the necessity of class analysis, organization, and all-encompassing propaganda, because a broad-based class struggle was unfolding. The fact is that the working masses are roused to a hutch of excitement by the social evils in Russian life, but we are unable to gather, if one may so put it, and concentrate all these drops and streamlets of popular resentment that are brought forth to a far larger extent than we imagine by the conditions of Russian life, and that must be combined into a single gigantic torrent. Lenin. What is to be done? 13. Under the existing conditions in the Federal Republic and West Berlin, we doubt it will be possible to create a strategy to unify the working class, or to create an organization that could simultaneously express and initiate the necessary unifying process. We doubt that the unity of the socialist intelligentsia and the proletariat can be molded out of the political programs or the declarations coming from the proletarian organizations. The drops and streamlets based on the horrors have long been collected by the Springer Corporation, to which they then add new horrors. We believe that without a revolutionary initiative, without the practical revolutionary intervention of the vanguard, the socialists, workers, and intellectuals, and without concrete anti-imperialist struggle, there will be no unifying process. Unity can only be created through the common struggle of the conscious section of the working class and the intellectuals, one which they do not stage manage, but which they model, or else it will not happen at all. Reach thousands of education-minded users daily. Advertise on your academy.